Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Dan Delamarine. I represent Southern New Hampshire University, and this is Flannery O'Connor, where spirituality meets practicality in personal relations. So, just a little bit about myself and my thesis together. When I was younger, I seriously considered becoming a Catholic priest. I pursued this goal from my junior year of high school to my junior year of undergraduate studies at Rowan University, and I applied to seminaries. I visited monasteries and friaries and other religious orders, and ultimately decided that the priesthood was not for me. However, my personal delving into Catholic spiritual writings led me to encounter the literary voice of Flannery O'Connor. I was exposed to her works here and there and heard her name a few times, but a pivotal point in my academic journey was when I visited Second Time Books in Mount Laurel, New Jersey, perused the shelves, and found her complete collection of short stories. I decided to challenge myself and put myself into her shoes, so to speak, because what intrigued me about what little I knew about her work was that it was controversial. The question is, how could a woman who is so devoutly Catholic hold such well known prejudices about Black Americans? This question can be applied to many of our own contemporary religious minds, because if there's anything high school psychology class can teach us, it's that everyone has their own prejudices, whether based on one's own experience or that of others. My response to the question of how could a woman who is so religious hold such prejudices in her personal life and in her work is this. The response is this. She was a product of her time. She was a white woman who came of age in the Jim Crow American South before the Civil Rights Movement began. This being said, she lived in a very spiritual environment. Although Catholics were a religious minority in her region, she also lived in what Ralph C. Wood called the Christ-haunted South. Although the lack of religion is becoming more and more prevalent in American culture today, I believe that her spirituality, while revealing someone far from perfect, can be reconciled with humanistic values as well as Christian values. As can be seen here, this is the table of contents as will follow in this presentation, which overviews my thesis. In brief, the question I am asking is how private institutionalized spirituality can lead to practical social doctrine. What we know about Flannery O'Connor is that she was a devout Irish American Catholic who lived through an era of shifting attitudes regarding race relations, the place of the woman, and diversity and equality in American culture. However, although there is plenty of literature on some of O'Connor's works, such as her short story A Good Man is Hard to Find, there is limited research on other stories of hers, such as The Heart of the Park, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, The Lame Shall Enter First, and Judgment Day. I am pursuing this research because I want to argue that Flannery O'Connor's spiritual themes can be reconciled with atheistic, agnostic, or irreligious attitudes prevailing in American culture today, which is important to spiritual scholars because the chasm between religious practitioners and non-practitioners must be bridged to produce further harmony and understanding. I am using cultural studies to analyze O'Connor's work to investigate why her symbolism is important to readers today. I will be using close reading and cultural application to investigate why O'Connor's works are relevant to the American reader today, as is appropriate because O'Connor's relevance today is predicated on her symbolism and how it can be understood by today's literary mind. So the problem to be analyzed here is how Flannery O'Connor's religious values resonate with secular American culture today, especially given that non-religion, atheism, and agnosticism are on the rise. Contingently, the question must be answered of how private and or institutionalized spirituality leads to practical social doctrine. How is it that what one believes leads to what one practices and applies to the world around that person? So, to view contributions, one must first look at A Good Man is Hard to Find. It's arguably O'Connor's most renowned work, having lent its name to a collection of short stories by the author. There has always been plenty of scholarship on it. For instance, in one of O'Connor's letters, which is placed in The Habit of Being, Flannery O'Connor, The Habit of Being, which is the collection of her letters, In one of those letters, the author writes about how university students were arguing whether or not the black hat worn by the antagonist called the Misfit was symbolic of his evil character. To which O'Connor replied, no, the point of the Misfit's hat was to cover the Misfit's head. But that's beside the point. One of the reasons why this story is so well studied by critics is that it helped O'Connor achieve her literary fame, but it also deals with a myriad of themes, such as the place of the woman, values to be held by a drastically changing society, and the disintegration of the family. But also, length is key. This is the longest story of O'Connor's bibliography. And you know what they say, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. It's hard to ignore such a long story, especially when her other stories are so short. This being said, however, while A Good Man is Hard to Find is so well reviewed, O'Connor makes note in various letters, again in The Habit of Being, her collection of letters, that some of her other stories, for instance A Temple of the Holy Ghost, rarely receive commentary at all. The other stories examined in my literature and my thesis, that is, The Heart of the Park, A Temple of the Holy Ghost, The Lame Shall Enter First, and Judgment Day, are all much shorter than A Good Man is Hard to Find, and so they fly under the radar, except for in books about O'Connor. That is to say, although there aren't many scholarly articles about Judgment Day or The Heart of the Park, analysis is found in extensive investigations into O'Connor's style, as will be discussed further down the line. Something else that must be mentioned is that in the spiritual arena, O'Connor has been analyzed as an everyday Thomistic theologian. Spiritual scholars have evaluated O'Connor's writings in relation to the natural law of St. Thomas Aquinas, which O'Connor writes is the key to man's true happiness, as it leads to union with God. Some recommended reading that we have, if one wants to look deeper onto the stories that aren't covered so much in scholarly articles, are Radical Ambivalence by Angela Lima O'Donnell, Understanding Flannery O'Connor by Margaret Early Witt, and Understanding the Hillbilly Thomist, Father Damien Ferentz. In my thesis, I practiced close reading of O'Connor's text through the lens of cultural studies. What this means in a nutshell is that if one reads closely enough, he can see that O'Connor uses her literature to help make sense of the changing world she lived in. She particularly used the genre of Southern Gothicism, which is reviewed in my thesis, to illustrate the contorted and disturbing elements of life such as hatred and poverty. Flannery O'Connor believed that a person's primary purpose in order to become happy, as I said before, is to seek union with God. American culture, however, is becoming increasingly atheistic and agnostic. This signals a contrariness to what O'Connor argued during her life. This lack of cooperative spirituality can be reconciled, however, by acknowledging the spiritual as well as the humanist ideal of union with each other as people. This calls for a collective, systemic effort to eliminate the prejudice that lies within each person through deliberate communication and socialization of children as primary school students and beyond. This being said, radical efforts must be likewise made within the household to educate children in matters of morals. Although no mandate can adequately enforce this education of the young, there must be inspiration on the part of the leaders of the culture in order to bring about understanding and care for other people. Flannery O'Connor's religious background and values can be reconciled to contemporary secular American culture and humanist values through the use of cultural studies as practiced through close reading and application of the literature to the events surrounding O'Connor's life. As the ancient Greeks and Romans and Egyptians had a habit of using myth to explain the events surrounding their own lives, O'Connor uses ancient Christocentric Thomistic theology to color her view of the world. One has to question how O'Connor would have matured in her view on race relations had she lived past the age of 39 and didn't die in 1964. For instance, she had very strong opinions, negative opinions, about the majority of African Americans and she did not like Dr. Martin Luther King. In fact, calling him the opposite of a saint, not, or rather, calling him not the age's great saint, but at the same time applauded what he was doing for the civil rights movement. Although many of her private letters have been published in Flannery O'Connor, The Habit of Being, one has to question how genuine her perspectives were in relation to who she was writing to. She had no husband or children, and so it is impossible to understand who she really was behind the letters, although in many ways she was indeed genuine. I say this because those who knew the author well repeated that she never considered herself an intellectual, right? An intellectual, and indeed looked down her nose on those who were. She laughed, for example, at those who used psychoanalysis on her works, believing that her works were down to earth and did not merit such analysis. But my recommendation is that O'Connor's work must be studied more closely. Not just A Good Man is Hard to Find, but the stories that aren't reviewed enough. We must be brave enough to venture into uncharted territory to understand how the author matured in her views on personal relations so we can see where we can improve ourselves in regard to our own personal relations. Thank you. Again, my name is Dan Delamarine. I represent Southern New Hampshire University, and this has been Flannery O'Connor, where spirituality meets practicality in personal relations. Real quick, I would like to thank the following people in particular for encouraging and assisting me in this work, which has taken up so much of my time in this last term. I would like to thank Mom, Dad, and my sister. I would like to thank my family because they gave me encouragement even when I didn't believe in myself to continue on this path. I would like to thank Miss Elaine Winder and Mrs. Renee Del Gercio, who were teachers of mine back in high school, back when I was struggling academically, and they reinvigorated me with a love for literature. They made me ask more curious questions about literature. I would like to thank Dr. Dane Spencer, my thesis supervisor, and Miss Samantha Atkins, my peer reviewer. And I recommend looking at these cited works because they greatly colored my view on Flannery O'Connor and enlightened me as to questions I was curious about. Again, thank you very much